The ghost arrived before the sun. He moved through the hallowed, sleeping halls of the Thurgood Marshall Federal Courthouse, a silent wraith armed not with chains but with a bucket of soapy water and a string mop. The marble floors, a checkerboard of ivory and obsidian, were his dominion in these pre-dawn hours. He worked with a slow, rhythmic grace, the swish-slap of the mop head echoing in the cavernous silence like a steady, melancholic heartbeat. His name was Samuel Carter, though few who saw him knew it, and none who knew it used it. To the river of expensive suits and frantic energy that would soon flood these corridors, he was simply the janitor. An obstacle to be sidestepped, a background detail to be ignored, a function rather than a person. His uniform, a pair of gray, thrice-patched overalls over a faded chambray shirt, rendered him invisible. His tools were his identity, but in the quiet solitude of 5 a.m., Samuel was not invisible. He was a guardian. He saw the ghosts of trials past lingering in the empty jury boxes. He felt the phantom weight of verdicts hanging in the air, the faint, lingering scent of triumph and despair. He knew every creak of the polished oak benches, every scuff on the brass fixtures, every place where the varnish had worn thin from the nervous hands of 1,000 litigants. This morning, his rounds took him to Courtroom 4B, the grandest of them all. It was the arena for the titans, reserved for cases that made headlines and fortunes. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors and the smell of old paper, lemon polish and faint residual anxiety washed over him. He started by the witness stand, his damp mop erasing the day's collection of footprints, a physical absolution. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea and etched with the fine lines of a life lived long and hard, drifted to the judge's bench. It was a formidable structure of dark mahogany, elevated and imposing, designed to project power and impartiality. He had polished its surface 1,000 times, his reflection a distorted, hunched figure in the gleaming wood. But sometimes in the deep quiet, he saw another reflection superimposed over his own, a memory of a man in a black robe, with a younger face, a straighter back, and eyes that held not just sadness but authority. He paused, his gnarled hands resting on the worn handle of his mop. A whisper of a memory brushed against his mind, the weight of that robe on his own shoulders, the solid feel of the gavel in his hand, the immense, crushing responsibility of holding a life in the balance. It was a lifetime ago. A different man. A different world. He shook his head, a gesture so slight it was barely a movement, and banished the ghost. He was Samuel Carter, the janitor. He had a floor to mop. And in a few hours the world would wake up. The sun would stream through the tall, arched windows, and the players would arrive for the latest spectacle. Among them would be Alex Thompson, a man who saw the world not in shades of gray, but in the stark, unforgiving black and white of winners and losers. And he, Samuel knew, was firmly in the latter category. He was a mess to be cleaned up, a floor to be walked over. Samuel dipped his mop back into the bucket. The water rippled, distorting his reflection into something unrecognizable. He began to work again, the steady swish-slap a quiet, lonely prayer in the heart of sleeping justice. Alex Thompson didn't walk, he conquered. His stride was a symphony of bespoke tailoring and inherited confidence. The clicks of his Italian leather shoes on the marble floor, a percussive announcement of his arrival. At 28 he was the rising star of Thompson, Sterling and Finch, a law firm whose name was whispered with the same reverence reserved for old money and new power. The Thompson was his father, a legal predator of the old guard. Alex was the new breed. Sleeker, faster, and twice as hungry. His world was a curated collection of sharp angles and gleaming surfaces. His corner office on the 42nd floor offered a panoramic view of the city, a concrete kingdom he intended to rule. His suit, a custom Tom Ford in charcoal gray, was his armor. His smile, a brilliant flash of perfectly capped teeth, was his weapon. He saw life as a courtroom, a place of adversarial combat where empathy was a weakness and victory was the only metric of worth. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," his paralegal, a nervous young man named Brian, chirped as Alex swept past his desk. Alex didn't break stride. "The preliminary injunction filings for the OmniCorp case. On my desk in 5 minutes, Brian." Collated, tabbed, and error-free. "An error will cost you your weekend. A second one will cost you your job." He didn't need to look back to know the effect his words had. He could feel the spike of fear and adrenaline he left in his wake. It was fuel. The Omnicorp case was his current masterpiece. He was defending a multi-billion-dollar tech conglomerate accused of stealing proprietary code from a small, idealistic startup called Innovate. It was a classic David versus Goliath story, and Alex had every intention of making sure David was left a bloody smear on the pavement. The truth of the matter, whether Omnicorp was guilty or not, was an irrelevant, almost quaint consideration. The only truth was the one he could construct, the one he could sell to a judge and jury. He dropped his briefcase beside his glass and chrome desk and surveyed his domain. The city sprawled below him, a grid of power and ambition. He felt a familiar surge of superiority. This was where he belonged, up here, looking down. His father, Arthur Thompson, appeared in his doorway. Arthur was a man carved from granite and ambition, his presence filling the room with a heavy, judgmental gravity. Alexander. The Innovate team filed a motion to compel discovery last night. They're getting desperate. Let them, Alex said, loosening his tie with a flick of his wrist. Desperation is the smell of blood in the water. Their lead counsel is a legal aid refugee named Sarah Jennings. She's passionate. She's principled. She's going to be gloriously easy to crush. Arthur's lips curled into a rare thin smile. Don't get cocky. Passion can be dangerous in a courtroom. It can sway a jury. A jury sees what I tell them to see, Alex countered, his voice smooth and certain. By the time I'm done with her star witness, they'll believe he stole the code from us. Appearances, Dad. That's the whole game. You taught me that. Indeed, Arthur said, his eyes scanning his son with a look that was equal parts pride and appraisal. See that you remember it. Judge Albright is presiding. He's an old-school stickler for decorum. Don't let your showboating offend him. Don't worry, Alex said, flashing his weaponized smile. I'll be the most decorous shark in the tank. He spent the morning in a whirlwind of calculated aggression, dictating brutal depositions, eviscerating opposing counsel on conference calls, and sharpening the points of his opening statement until they were razor-fine. He operated on a cocktail of caffeine, adrenaline, and an unshakable belief in his own superiority. Around noon he strode from his office, a junior associate named Marcus trailing in his wake like a pilot fish. The key, Alex was explaining, gesturing with a sleek fountain pen, is to dismantle their narrative before it's even built. We don't just attack their evidence. We attack their character. We make Innovate CEO look like a failed dreamer who's trying to litigate his way out of incompetence. As they swept into the lobby, heading for a power lunch, they passed one of the firm's cleaning staff, an older woman with tired eyes and a stooped back, wiping down the brass nameplate by the elevators. Alex didn't even register her presence. She was part of the infrastructure, as inanimate as the ficus plant in the corner. He was a winner. She was not. The world was neatly, efficiently organized in this way. It was a truth as solid and unyielding as the granite floors beneath his feet. Samuel Carter's apartment was a single room in a quiet, forgotten corner of the city, a neighborhood of brick row houses and old trees that had resisted the relentless march of glass and steel. The room was monastic in its simplicity. A narrow bed neatly made, a small wooden table with 2 chairs, a hot plate, a bookshelf, and a single deep armchair worn soft with age. There were no photographs, no mementos, no ghosts of a past life cluttering the surfaces. The ghosts were all inside him. His day began long before the city stirred. He would sit in his armchair as the sky outside his window shifted from inky black to bruised purple, a cup of black coffee warming his hands. This was his time for reflection, a quiet communion with the man he used to be. He didn't think in terms of specific cases or legal precedents anymore. Instead, he remembered faces. The face of a young mother, acquitted of a crime she didn't commit, her tears of relief a cleansing rain. The face of a CEO convicted of fraud, his mask of arrogance crumbling to reveal the terrified child beneath. The face of a young man, sentenced for a violent act, his eyes holding a terrifying, unrepentant emptiness. And one face he could never escape. The face of his wife, Eleanor, her laughter echoing in the chambers of his heart. The face of his daughter, Lily, her small hand tucked into his as they walked through the park. Their faces frozen in time, on the day a drunk driver with a team of slick lawyers had turned their world to ash. The legal system he had dedicated his life to, The system he believed in with a fervent, almost religious devotion, had failed him in the most profound way imaginable. The driver, the scion of a wealthy family, had walked away with a slap on the wrist. A loophole. Technicality. A brilliant lawyer who knew how to turn justice into a game. Samuel remembered the lawyer's smug, satisfied smile. It looked a lot like the smile he sometimes saw on the face of that young man at the courthouse, Mr. Thompson. The grief had been a tidal wave that had shattered his life, leaving behind a landscape of ruins. The black robe felt like a shroud. The gavel felt like a weapon he no longer knew how to wield. And so, one day he had simply walked away. He resigned his lifetime appointment, put his house in a blind trust to fund anonymous charities, and vanished. He had tried other things. He'd worked in a library, a bookstore, a community garden. But the pull of the courthouse was too strong. It was the epicenter of his life's work and his life's greatest tragedy. He couldn't be a part of the system anymore, but he couldn't abandon it either. So he became its caretaker, its ghost. As a janitor, he was an observer. He saw everything. He saw the public defenders like Sarah Jennings, burning with righteous fire, buried under mountains of paperwork, fighting for clients the world had forgotten. He saw the prosecutors, some driven by justice, others by ambition. He saw the families huddled on the hard benches, their lives hanging by the thin thread of a verdict. And he saw the lawyers like Alex Thompson. He saw their swagger, their expensive suits that smelled of entitlement, their casual cruelty. He'd seen Alex in action once during a pretrial hearing. The young man was brilliant, a master of procedure and rhetoric. He was a finely tuned instrument of legal warfare. But his eyes were cold, empty of the one thing that gave the law its soul, humanity. Samuel finished his coffee and stood. He pulled on his clean, worn overalls. He was not Judge Carter anymore. Judge Carter was a memory, a ghost who lived in an empty room. He was Sam, the janitor. He had a job to do. When he arrived at the courthouse, the morning rush was in full swing. He kept to the edges of the corridors, a slow-moving rock in a fast-flowing river. He was emptying a trash can near the elevators when Alex Thompson and his entourage swept by. He heard a snatch of their conversation. "Make her look like a fool for even bringing the suit," Alex was saying. He didn't glance at Samuel, his eyes fixed on some distant point of victory. Samuel finished with the bin and began wiping down the polished brass mail slot nearby. He worked with methodical precision, his reflection in the metal a blurred gray smudge. He was used to being invisible. In many ways he preferred it. Invisibility was a kind of freedom. It allowed him to see without being seen, to listen without being heard. It allowed him to be the custodian of the echoes, the silent witness to the great, messy, heartbreaking drama of justice. Courtroom 4B was more than a room. It was a theater of power. The air hummed with a nervous electric energy. Sunlight filtered through the massive, cathedral-like windows, cut sharp geometric patterns on the dark wood and worn carpets, illuminating dust motes dancing in the silent air like tiny, restless spirits. Alex Thompson stood at the plaintiff's table, a portrait of serene confidence. He adjusted the knot of his silk tie, shot his cuffs, and surveyed the room with the cool appraisal of a conductor before a symphony. His team was assembled behind him. Brian, his paralegal, pale and sweating slightly, organizing files with trembling precision. Marcus, the junior associate, trying to emulate Alex's confident posture and failing. Across the aisle, the opposition. Sarah Jennings was everything Alex was not. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical, no-nonsense bun. Her suit was a simple, off-the-rack navy blue, respectable but lacking the intimidating sheen of Alex's bespoke armor. She sat beside her client, a man named Ben Carter, a brilliant but unassuming software engineer in his late 40s who looked terrified, like a man who had wandered into the wrong gladiator pit. He was the David in this scenario, and he looked hopelessly outmatched. Alex felt a familiar, pleasant tightening in his gut, the thrill of the hunt. He caught Sarah's eye and gave her a small condescending nod, a gesture that said, "You're in my world now." He saw her jaw clench. Good. He wanted her off balance. The clerk's voice rang out, sharp and formal. "All rise." The room shuffled to its feet as Judge Albright entered. He was a man in his late 60s, with a fringe of white hair and a face that seemed permanently set in an expression of mild disapproval. He moved with a stiff, arthritic gait and settled into his enormous chair with a weary sigh, as if the weight of the law was a physical burden. "Mr. Thompson, you may begin," the judge rasped, his voice thin but clear. Alex glided to the lectern. He began his opening statement, his voice a perfectly modulated instrument, smooth, confident, and utterly compelling. He didn't use notes. He spoke directly to the jury, his hands gesturing with practiced ease. He painted a picture of Omnicorp as a pillar of American innovation, a benevolent giant providing jobs and pushing the boundaries of technology. Then, with a subtle shift in tone, he began to paint Ben Carter and his little company, Innovate, as pathetic, grasping failures. "The evidence will show," Alex purred, his eyes sweeping across the jury, "that Innovate was a company on the brink of collapse, a dream that had turned into a financial nightmare. And in a last desperate attempt to save his sinking ship, Mr. Carter has concocted this fantasy. A story of theft and corporate espionage that is more suited to a cheap paperback novel than a federal courtroom." He saw Ben Carter flinch. He saw Sarah Jennings scribbling furiously on her legal pad. He was in complete control. When it was Sarah's turn, her approach was the polar opposite. She spoke with a quiet, earnest passion, her voice sometimes trembling with conviction. She laid out a simple chronological narrative, supported by emails and internal documents, showing how Omnicorp had entered into partnership talks with Innovate, gained access to their revolutionary code under a non-disclosure agreement, and then abruptly broken off contact before launching a new product that was functionally identical. "This case isn't about a failed dream," she said, her gaze firm and unwavering. "It's about a stolen one. It's about a corporate Goliath deciding it was easier to steal from David than to compete with him." It was a good line, Alex admitted to himself. But passion was messy. It was emotional. He preferred the cold, clean logic of demolition. The trial unfolded over the next several days. Alex was a master puppeteer, pulling strings, setting traps, and turning the courtroom into his personal stage. During his cross-examination of Ben Carter, he was merciless. He twisted Ben's words, painted his ambition as greed, and made his lack of business savvy seem like a character flaw. "So, Mr. Carter," Alex began, circling him like a shark, "you admit your company was millions of dollars in debt at the time of your meetings with Omnicorp? We had taken on investment to fund development, yes?" Ben said, his voice strained. "Investment," Alex repeated, savoring the word. "A more accurate term might be crippling debt. Wouldn't you agree? You were desperate. You needed a lifeline. And Omnicorp was your winning lottery ticket, wasn't it?" "No. They were interested in our technology. Or perhaps," Alex leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "you saw a deep-pocketed company and you decided to fabricate a claim, hoping for a quick settlement to solve your money problems. It's a compelling story, I'll grant you that." He saw the seeds of doubt he was planting in the jury's eyes. He saw the way Ben's shoulders slumped in defeat. It was a virtuoso performance of character assassination. During a brief recess on the third day, the courtroom buzzed with activity as lawyers conferred with clients and clerks shuffled papers. Alex, high on his own performance, stood with his team, accepting their fawning praise. It was then that he noticed the janitor. The old man, Sam, was mopping up a small coffee spill near the jury box, his movements slow and methodical. He was an unremarkable fixture, a piece of the scenery. Alex felt a sudden, sharp stab of contempt. Here he was, a master of the universe, shaping destinies and fortunes with his intellect and will. And there was this man, this nobody, cleaning up literal messes. The contrast was so stark, so satisfying. He felt the need to articulate it, to perform his superiority for his audience of junior associates and wealthy clients. He raised his voice just enough to carry a stage whisper intended for the whole room. "You see that?" he said, gesturing with a flick of his chin towards Sam. "That's the world in a nutshell. Some people spend their lives creating empires. Others spend their lives cleaning up the messes." A few sycophantic snickers rippled through his entourage. His client, the CEO of Omnicorp, a man whose ethics were as polished and empty as his shoes, chuckled appreciatively. Sam froze for a single fractional second. His back was to them, but Alex imagined he could see the old man's shoulders tense. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the air conditioning and the distant city traffic. Then the janitor straightened up slowly. He didn't turn around. He didn't acknowledge the comment in any way. He simply dipped his mop back into the bucket and continued his work, his movements just as deliberate, just as methodical as before. But something had shifted. A flicker of pain, as subtle as a heat shimmer, had crossed the old man's face before he'd turned away. Alex saw it, and it gave him a small dark thrill. He had landed a blow. He had asserted the natural order of things. He was a creator. The janitor was a cleaner. The world was as it should be. He turned back to his adoring circle, the old man already forgotten, and began planning his next kill. The words, though not directed at him by name, landed on Samuel Carter with the force of a physical blow. It was a familiar kind of pain, the casual, unthinking cruelty of the privileged. He had felt it 1,000 times since he'd traded his robe for overalls. The averted eyes, the dismissive gestures, the assumptions made based on his clothes and his menial task. Some people spend their lives creating empires. Others spend their lives cleaning up the messes. For a fleeting instant, the quiet, ordered world inside him threatened to fracture. A hot surge of anger, an old forgotten reflex, rose in his chest. The judge within him, the man who had commanded respect and wielded authority, wanted to turn to fix Alex Thompson with a stare that could peel paint, and deliver a judgment so scathing it would strip the arrogance from him layer by layer. But the judge was a ghost. Instead, Samuel did what he had trained himself to do for 20 years. He absorbed the blow. He let it settle inside him, alongside all the other slights and sorrows. He found the flicker of his own pride and gently extinguished it. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. It was an anchor that would drag him back into a world he had deliberately left behind. He focused on the task at hand, the spill of coffee on the floor. It was a small, contained problem in a world full of sprawling, unsolvable ones. He could fix this. He dipped his mop, wrung it out, and with a steady hand he erased the stain. It was a small act of restoration, of bringing order to a tiny patch of chaos. It was his purpose now. He finished his work in the courtroom and pushed his cart out into the hallway. The laughter from Thompson's group followed him for a few paces before fading, replaced by the general hum of the courthouse. He didn't feel anger anymore, just a profound and weary sadness. It wasn't for himself. It was for the young man. To be so brilliant, so gifted, and yet so utterly blind. To have so much power and so little wisdom. It was a tragedy of a different kind. He continued his rounds, his mind drifting back. He remembered a case from early in his career. A brilliant young surgeon, arrogant and convinced of his own infallibility, had been accused of malpractice after a patient died on his operating table. The surgeon's defense was a masterclass in deflection and condescension. He treated the grieving family's lawyer with the same contempt Alex Thompson showed for everyone he deemed beneath him. Samuel, a young judge then, had listened patiently. He had seen past the arrogance to the fear beneath, the fear of being wrong, the fear of being fallible. In his ruling, he had found the surgeon liable, not just because of the evidence, but because the surgeon's hubris had made him careless. He had delivered his judgment not with anger, but with a quiet sorrow. "A man's talent is a gift," he remembered saying, his voice echoing in the memory of that long-ago courtroom. "But his character is a choice. You are a man of immense talent, doctor. But your character has failed you. And it has failed the person who put their life in your hands." The surgeon had been ruined, but years later, Samuel had received a letter. It was from the doctor, who was now working at a free clinic in a poor rural county. The letter was short. It just said, "Thank you. You saved my life by destroying it." Samuel wondered if anyone would ever be able to reach the man inside Alex Thompson. His thoughts were interrupted by a quiet voice. "Sam." He turned to see Sarah Jennings standing beside him. She looked exhausted, the strain of the trial etched on her face. But her eyes were kind. She was one of the few who always saw him, who always used his name. "You okay?" she asked. "I heard what he said. Thompson. He's a real piece of work." Samuel offered her a small, gentle smile. "Words are just air, Miss Jennings. They only have the power you give them. I wish I could believe that, she sighed, leaning against the wall. He's tearing my client apart in there. Ben is a good man. He's telling the truth. But Thompson is making him look like a liar and a fool. Samuel looked at her, seeing the fire of her conviction banked by the exhaustion of the fight. He felt an old familiar instinct, the urge to guide, to teach. He chose his words carefully. Mr. Thompson is building a house of cards, he said, his voice low and soft. It's impressive from a distance, but the foundation is weak. He's focused on your client's character. Perhaps you should focus on his. Sarah looked at him, puzzled. Thompson's character? The truth has a certain weight, Miss Jennings, Samuel said, beginning to slowly push his cart down the hall. A lie is light. It needs to be decorated, propped up, sold. The truth just is, don't try to sell your story. Just tell it, and let the jury feel the weight of it. He left her there in the hallway, a thoughtful frown on her face. He had said too much, perhaps. It was not his place, but he couldn't help it. He had spent his life tending to the garden of justice. It pained him to see someone trampling the flowers with such careless disregard. He retreated to his small, windowless supply closet in the courthouse basement. It was his sanctuary, a space that smelled of bleach, sawdust, and old damp concrete. It was here, surrounded by the tools of his trade, that he could finally let the mask of placid indifference fall. He sat on an overturned bucket, the silence of the basement a comforting blanket. He closed his eyes. The young lawyer's words echoed again, this time with no defense to soften them. Cleaning up the messes. For 20 years, that's what he had tried to do. He had tried to clean up the mess inside himself, the wreckage of grief and disillusionment. He had tried to atone for the failure of the system he had once embodied. He had chosen a life of humility, of service, of silence. But today, for the first time in a long time, the silence felt heavy, felt less like a choice and more like a sentence. He gripped his calloused hands together, the knuckles white. He was an old man on a bucket in a basement, a ghost haunted by the man he once was. And upstairs, in the sunlit world of power and consequence, the game went on without him. The trial resumed. Alex, feeling energized by his public assertion of dominance, was ready to deliver the killing blow. He called Omnicorp's star witness, a renowned software expert, to the stand. The expert, a man with a string of degrees and an air of unshakable authority, proceeded to deliver a jargon-filled, highly technical testimony that essentially concluded Ben Carter's code was amateurish and Omnicorp's was a work of unparalleled genius, with any similarities being purely coincidental. It was a devastating blow to Innovate's case. Alex watched the jury's faces, saw their confusion at the technical details morph into acceptance of the expert's confident conclusions. He saw the hope drain from Ben Carter's face, leaving behind a gray mask of despair. When it was Sarah Jennings' turn to cross-examine, Alex leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. This was going to be a bloodbath. She was a passionate idealist, not a tech wizard. She would be lost in the weeds of algorithms and source code. But something was different about her. She seemed calmer, more centered. She approached the witness not with aggression, but with a quiet, almost curious demeanor. Samuel's words echoed in her mind. The truth has a certain weight. She began not by questioning the expert's technical analysis, but by questioning his process. Dr. Evans, she started, her voice even. In your report, you state that you spent approximately 80 hours reviewing the code from both companies. Is that correct? That is correct, Dr. Evans said, looking down his nose at her. And Omnicorp paid you a fee of $200,000 for this report and your testimony today? My fees are standard for an expert of my caliber. Alex shifted in his seat. This was standard stuff, trying to paint the expert as a hired gun. It wouldn't work. I'm not questioning your fee, doctor, Sarah said calmly. I'm questioning your time. 80 hours. For 2 massive, complex code bases. That's quite efficient. She then produced a sworn affidavit from another expert, a professor at MIT, who stated that a thorough, line-by-line comparison of such code would take a minimum of 300 hours. Is it your testimony, Dr. Evans, Sarah asked, her voice still quiet but now with a sharp edge, that you are nearly 4 times more efficient than the head of computer science at MIT? The expert sputtered, for the first time looking flustered. "My methods are proprietary. I have developed systems." Sarah didn't let him finish. She moved on, not to the code but to his history. She brought up 3 prior cases where he had testified for the winning side. All large corporations accused of malfeasance. In each case, his reports had been instrumental. And in each case, it was later discovered that he held significant stock options in the parent companies of those corporations. "Dr. Evans," Sarah said, "do you or any entity you control currently hold any stock or options in Omnicorp or any of its subsidiary companies?" The courtroom went silent. The expert's face went from pink to a blotchy red. He looked to Alex for help, but Alex could do nothing. It was a legitimate question. That is a matter of my private financial portfolio," the expert stammered. "It's a simple yes or no question, doctor," Sarah pressed, her voice hardening. "Are you a financially disinterested party in the outcome of this trial?" The expert's eyes darted around the room. He licked his lips. "I object," Alex shouted, rising to his feet. "Relevance." "Overruled, Mr. Thompson," Judge Albright rasped, leaning forward with newfound interest. "The witness will answer the question." Dr. Evans looked like a trapped animal. "I may have a small managed holding," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. The dam had broken. For the next hour, Sarah skillfully and methodically dismantled him. The small holding turned out to be a significant block of shares. The 80 hours of analysis was revealed to be a cursory review done mostly by his graduate students. The confident, unshakable expert was exposed as a biased, overpaid charlatan. By the time she was done, his credibility was in ashes. He practically fled the witness stand. Alex was stunned. His perfectly constructed case now had a gaping hole in it. He looked at the jury and saw not confusion but suspicion. They were looking at him at his table with doubt. He had been outmaneuvered by her. During the afternoon recess, the mood in his camp was grim. "How did she get that information?" Marcus asked, his voice full of disbelief. "She got lucky," Alex snapped, his voice tight with fury. He refused to admit that she had simply outlawyered him. He paced back and forth, the perfect crease in his trousers seeming to mock him. He stormed out of the courtroom needing air. As he passed down the hallway, he saw the old janitor, Sam, polishing a brass plaque on the wall. The old man was humming softly to himself, a tuneless, melancholic sound. For some reason, the sight of the old man's placid contentment filled Alex with a disproportionate rage. It was all part of the same cosmic insult. A second-rate lawyer had just humiliated him, and this non-entity was peacefully humming. He didn't say a word. He just glared at the back of the janitor's head as he walked past, a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. The foundation of his world had developed a hairline crack, and it was a sensation he did not enjoy. He promised himself he would seal that crack tomorrow. He would bring his full, unrestrained firepower to bear. He would not just win this case, he would annihilate them. The next morning, the atmosphere in courtroom 4B was thick with a new kind of tension. The previous day's events had shifted the dynamic. The Innovate team, once looking defeated, now had a spark of hope in their eyes. Alex's team was on edge, the air of invincibility replaced by a brittle defensiveness. Alex himself was a coiled spring of controlled fury. He had been up all night retooling his strategy, planning a brutal, relentless assault. Today, he would call Sarah Jennings' client, Ben Carter, back to the stand for recross-examination. He would not be gentle. He would tear him apart piece by piece, until nothing was left but a sniveling, incredible wreck. He would make the jury forget all about the disgraced expert witness. "All rise," the clerk called out. Everyone stood. But the side door from which Judge Albright usually emerged remained closed. A few seconds passed. Then a full minute. A confused murmur rippled through the courtroom. The clerk, looking flustered, approached the bench and spoke in a hushed tone to the court reporter. Then he turned to the room, his face pale. "There will be a slight delay, ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice unsteady. "Judge Albright was taken ill this morning. He has been transported to the hospital." A collective gasp went through the room. Alex felt a jolt of annoyance, not concern. A delay was inconvenient. It would disrupt his momentum. What does this mean? His client, the Omnicorp CEO, whispered urgently. It could mean a mistrial, Alex whispered back, his mind racing through the procedural possibilities. If they can't find a replacement judge to take over immediately, the whole thing gets thrown out. We'd have to start from scratch. Starting from scratch was not an appealing option. It would cost millions and give Innovate time to regroup. The minutes ticked by, stretching into an hour. The courtroom, once a formal arena, devolved into a sea of anxious chatter. Lawyers huddled, whispering into cell phones. The jury looked bored and confused. Finally, the clerk re-emerged from the judge's chambers, accompanied by a stern-looking woman Alex recognized as the chief clerk of the district court. The chief clerk approached the podium, her expression grim. Ladies and gentlemen, I can confirm that Judge Albright has suffered a serious medical event. He will, regrettably, be unable to continue with this trial. A fresh wave of murmurs. However, she continued, holding up a hand to quell the noise, to declare a mistrial in a case of this length and complexity would be a disservice to all parties and a waste of judicial resources. We have been making every effort to find a sitting judge who is available to take over the proceedings immediately. She paused, consulting a note in her hand. Unfortunately, due to a federal conference this week, every judge in this district is currently unavailable. Alex felt a grim satisfaction. A mistrial it was. He could live with that. But, the clerk said, her voice taking on a strange, almost dramatic tone, we have found a solution. There is a senior status judge who, though officially retired, retains his commission and is legally empowered to preside. He has been apprised of the situation, and he happens to be in the building today. This was highly unusual. A retired judge just happening to be in the building? He has reviewed the initial filings and the transcripts from the past few days, the chief clerk continued, and he has graciously agreed to step in to ensure that justice can proceed without further delay. A buzz of curiosity filled the room. Who could it be? A legendary name from the past? Alex leaned over to Marcus. Find out who it is. Any retired judge from this district. Quick. Marcus fumbled for his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. The chief clerk took a deep breath. She looked out across the courtroom, her eyes seeming to scan every face. All rise, she commanded, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. The room once again shuffled to its feet. The side door to the judge's chambers opened, but no one came out. Instead, the main doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and in walked Samuel Carter. He was not wearing his gray janitor's overalls. He had taken off the outer layer to reveal a simple, clean white shirt and a pair of neatly pressed dark trousers held up by suspenders. He wore no tie. He walked with the same slow, deliberate pace he always did, his worn work boots making soft, rhythmic sounds on the marble floor. Alex stared, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. It was the janitor. What was he doing? Had he been called to fix a light? To clean something up? He saw the bailiff, a burly man named David who was usually all business, approach Sam with a look of profound, almost reverential respect. David held a black judicial robe. The room was utterly, completely silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the city outside and the soft tread of Sam's boots. He walked past the public gallery. He walked past Alex's table. His eyes, those stormy gray seas of wisdom and sorrow, briefly met Alex's. There was no triumph in them, no animosity. There was just a deep, quiet knowing. He reached the front of the courtroom. The bailiff held the robe open, and Sam slipped his arms into it, the heavy black fabric settling on his stooped shoulders as if it were a familiar weight. He seemed to grow taller, straighter. The janitor vanished, and someone else began to emerge. He ascended the 3 steps to the bench, each step slow and measured. Alex was frozen, a statue of disbelief. This was impossible. A joke. A dream. The chief clerk, her voice filled with a deference that bordered on awe, made the official announcement. Presiding over this court, the Honorable Judge Samuel Carter. The name meant nothing to Alex. It was just a name. But beside him, his father, Arthur Thompson, made a small strangled noise. My God, Arthur whispered, his face ashen. It can't be. The Judge Carter? I thought he was dead. The gavel, sitting on the bench, looked impossibly small in front of the man who now stood behind it. He looked out over the stunned, silent courtroom. He picked up the gavel, the wood seeming to meld with his gnarled, work-worn hand, and then for the first time he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it filled the cavernous room with an effortless authority, a quiet power that resonated in the very bones of the building. "You may be seated," said the janitor. The gavel fell. The sound cracked through the silence like a thunderclap, and in that moment, Alex Thompson's world did not just crack. It shattered into a million pieces. The courtroom was a tableau of collective shock. People sat, but it was a mechanical, unthinking motion. Every eye was fixed on the man in the judge's robe, the man they had all seen 100 times but never truly looked at. The man who pushed a broom, who wiped up spills, who was as much a part of the building's infrastructure as the plumbing. Alex Thompson felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. His mind, usually a high-speed processor of logic and strategy, was a maelstrom of white noise confusion. The janitor, the old man he had mocked, the man who represented the lowest rung of the social ladder he had so triumphantly climbed, was now sitting in the highest seat of power in the room, looking down at him. It was a physical impossibility, a tear in the fabric of his reality. Beside him, his father was still muttering, his usual composure completely gone. Samuel the St. Carter, they called him that. The conscience of the federal bench. 25 years ago, he was the most respected, most feared judge in the state. Brilliant. Incorruptible. Then he just vanished. The story was his family, a car accident. He resigned. No one's seen him since. The whispers started to ripple through the room, first among the older lawyers, then spreading like wildfire. Phones were lighting up under tables as associates frantically Googled the name. Samuel Carter, legendary jurist, known for his landmark decisions on corporate ethics, walked away from a lifetime appointment. His tragic story, wife and daughter. The legend of the ghost judge, a story told to first-year law students as a cautionary tale about burnout and grief, was suddenly, impossibly, sitting before them in the flesh. On the other side of the aisle, Sarah Jennings was just as stunned, but her shock was tinged with a dawning, incredible sense of wonder. The kind old man who had given her quiet advice, whose wisdom she had felt but never understood, the man she had defended from Alex's cruel joke. It was him. The pieces clicked into place with a dizzying clarity. The sadness in his eyes, the quiet dignity, the weight of his simple words. Judge Carter let the silence stretch, allowing the shock to settle and transform into a new kind of order. He scanned the room, his gaze missing nothing. He looked at the jury, their faces a mixture of awe and confusion. He looked at the lawyers, the plaintiffs, the defendants. His gaze lingered for a second longer on Alex, a look devoid of judgment but heavy with unspoken meaning. Finally, he cleared his throat. The small sound was enough to command absolute attention. "Counsel will approach the bench," he said. His voice was the same low, soft one Samuel the janitor used, but now it was amplified by the acoustics of the room and the authority of his position. Alex moved as if in a trance. He and his father, along with Sarah Jennings, walked to the front and stood before the man they had known as Sam. Up close, the transformation was even more profound. The robe seemed to have straightened his spine. The weariness in his face was still there, but it was now overlaid with a sharp, formidable intelligence. The janitor was gone. Only the judge remained. "Good morning, counselors," Judge Carter said, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "There has been an unexpected transition. I trust we can all endeavor to make it a smooth one." He looked at Sarah. "Miss Jennings, I have read the transcript of your cross-examination of Dr. Evans. Well done. You sought the weight of the truth." Sarah flushed, mumbling a thank you. Then he turned his gaze to Alex. It felt like being weighed and measured on a cosmic scale. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his tone perfectly even, "I have also read the transcript of your cross-examination of Mr. Carter. It was a masterful performance of rhetoric. You built a very impressive house. I must caution you, however, that in my courtroom, houses require foundations, and the foundation must be fact." The words were spoken quietly, without malice, but they landed on Alex like hammer blows. He was being critiqued, no, dismissed by the janitor. The humiliation was so profound it was almost surreal. "Do you have any objections to my presiding over this case?" Judge Carter asked a direct challenge. What could he say? Object on what grounds? That the judge had been cleaning the toilets an hour ago? That he had personally insulted him? Any objection would only deepen his own disgrace. "No, Your Honor." Alex forced the words out. They felt like ash in his mouth. "No, Your Honor," his father echoed, his voice strained. "Good," Judge Carter said with a curt nod. "Then let us proceed. Mr. Thompson, I believe you were about to re-cross-examine the plaintiff." He gestured for them to return to their tables. As Alex turned, he felt 100 pairs of eyes on him. He saw the looks on the faces of his colleagues, his clients. The snickers from yesterday were gone, replaced by a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. The king had not just been checked. He had been toppled from the board by a pawn. He walked back to his table, his Italian leather shoes suddenly feeling heavy as lead. He sat down, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at his notes, the pages filled with his own sharp, confident handwriting. The plan for Ben Carter's evisceration. It all seemed ridiculous now, the posturing of an arrogant child. He had to stand up. He had to speak. He had to conduct an examination in front of a man who had heard his cruelest, most thoughtless words. He looked across the room at the man on the bench, the janitor, the judge, the Honorable Samuel Carter. And for the first time in his professional life, Alex Thompson, the apex predator, the master of the game, was terrified. He had no idea what the rules were anymore because the man who had written them had just taken the bench. The trial resumed, but it was a different trial. The very air in the courtroom had changed. The aggressive, theatrical combativeness that Alex had thrived on was gone, replaced by a quiet, intense focus. Judge Carter ran his courtroom not with a gavel and a loud voice, but with a palpable, unshakable moral gravity. Alex stood to begin his re-cross-examination of Ben Carter. His carefully prepared script of attacks and insinuations felt flimsy and vulgar under the judge's steady gaze. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice lacking its usual confident ring, "let's return to the issue of your company's financial state." He was cut off, not by an objection but by the judge himself. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Carter said, his voice calm but firm, "we have spent a considerable amount of time on the plaintiff's financial desperation. The jury has heard this. The transcript reflects it. Let us move on to something more substantive. Let us, for instance, talk about the code." Alex was thrown. It was highly unusual for a judge to intervene in the direction of an examination so directly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, my strategy is to establish motive." "Your strategy is noted," the judge interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "My interest is in establishing fact. You have made your point about motive. Now either present new information or move on. This court is not interested in repetition." Humiliated, Alex scrambled for a new line of questioning. He tried to pivot to the technical details, hoping to trip Ben up, but his heart wasn't in it. His attacks felt hollow, his snide remarks childish. Every question he asked, he imagined how it sounded to the man on the bench, the man who had cleaned the floors, the man who knew the weight of real tragedy. Judge Carter's interventions were subtle but constant. When Alex tried to badger Ben with rapid-fire, confusing questions, the judge would quietly say, "Mr. Thompson, give the witness time to answer the question you actually asked." When Alex tried to introduce a piece of evidence of questionable relevance, the judge would look at him over the top of a pair of half-moon glasses he had produced from a pocket of his robe and say, "Counsel, where are you going with this? Connect the dots for me." It was like playing chess against a grandmaster who could see 10 moves ahead. Alex felt stripped bare, his arsenal of rhetorical tricks rendered useless. He was being forced to practice law, not just perform it. He was being held to a standard of substance over style, and he was coming up short. The most unnerving part was the judge's impartiality. He held Sarah Jennings to the same high standard. When she, buoyed by the shift in momentum, started to veer into overly emotional territory during her redirect, Judge Carter reined her injustice firmly. "Ms. Jennings, the witness's feelings are not evidence. Stick to the facts of the case, please." He was not taking sides. He was serving the process. He was serving the truth. It was a foreign and deeply unsettling concept to Alex. The change was most evident in the jury. Under Judge Albright, they had been passive observers, occasionally swayed by Alex's showmanship. Under Judge Carter, they were active participants. He would often address them directly, simplifying complex legal concepts, ensuring they understood the significance of a piece of evidence. He treated them not as an audience to be manipulated, but as partners in a sacred duty. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said at one point, after a particularly dense exchange about intellectual property law, "put simply, the question before you is this: did Company A take something that belonged to Company B? The contracts and the code are the tools to help you answer that question. Do not be intimidated by the complexity. Focus on the fundamental fairness. That is your task." During a recess, Alex retreated to a small conference room with his father and the Omnicorp CEO. The CEO was furious. "What is this?" he raged. This janitor is running a kangaroo court. He's biased. He's costing us this case." "He is the furthest thing from biased," Arthur Thompson said, his voice grim. He looked a decade older than he had that morning. "He's being what a judge is supposed to be. That's the problem. Your case was built on style and misdirection, Alex. Carter sees right through that. He's interested in what's true. So what do we do?" Alex asked, feeling a desperate, unfamiliar helplessness. "You answer the man's question," Arthur said, looking his son directly in the eye. "You find a foundation of fact for your arguments. You stop performing and start lawyering. Because if you don't, that janitor is going to hand you the most resounding defeat of your career." Alex left the room, his father's words ringing in his ears. He walked down the corridor, his mind a chaotic mess. He saw Judge Carter leaving the courtroom, heading back to his chambers. He was no longer wearing the robe. He was just the old man again in his simple white shirt and trousers. He walked with that same slow, steady pace. As he passed Alex, he paused for a moment. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice quiet for Alex's ears only. "A word of advice. The strongest branch is not the one that is most rigid. It is the one that is willing to bend." He then continued down the hall, leaving Alex standing alone, his reflection in the polished marble floor a perfect image of a man whose entire world had been turned upside down. The janitor had just offered him legal advice. And the most infuriating, humbling part of it all was that he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was the best advice he had ever received. The trial wore on, each day a lesson in humility for Alex Thompson. He tried to adapt, to follow his father's and the judge's advice. He stripped his arguments of their usual florid rhetoric and focused on the driest, hardest facts he could muster. But it felt like fighting with one hand tied behind his back. His entire legal style, his very identity as a lawyer, was built on the foundation of performance, and that foundation had been declared unsound. He found himself watching Judge Carter obsessed. He watched the way the man listened. A deep, active listening that seemed to absorb not just the words being spoken, but the intent and emotion behind them. He watched his hands, gnarled and calloused from years of manual labor, as they rested calmly on the bench. Those hands had signed orders that changed lives, and they had scrubbed floors. The dichotomy was something Alex's mind could not reconcile. One afternoon, seeking to understand, Alex did what he did best: research. He had his firm's library pull every available record on Judge Samuel Carter. The file that landed on his desk was thick. He spent the night in his office, the city lights twinkling below him, and he read. He read about Carter's early life. A scholarship kid from a poor neighborhood who had clawed his way to the top of his class at Harvard Law. He read his judicial opinions, which were lauded for their clarity, their intellectual rigor, and their profound compassion. He was a conservative judge on matters of law, a strict constitutionalist, but a liberal on matters of the human heart. He was known for his tough sentences on white-collar criminals and his merciful approach to those whose crimes were born of desperation. Then Alex got to the end of the file. The news clippings. A grainy black and white photo of a car wreck. A headline: Judge Carter's family killed in tragic collision. The story was stark and brutal. Eleanor Carter, 45, a beloved local painter. Lily Carter, 9. Both killed instantly when their car was struck by a driver who ran a red light. The driver was a 22-year-old named Brady Thompson, no relation, a fact Alex checked 3 times with a racing heart. Brady was the son of a real estate tycoon. Alex read on, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Brady Thompson had been drunk, well over the legal limit, but he had been represented by one of the best, most ruthless defense attorneys in the state. The case was a showcase of legal maneuvering. Key evidence was suppressed on a technicality. A witness was discredited. The defense team argued that the traffic light had been malfunctioning, creating a fog of reasonable doubt. The verdict: not guilty of vehicular manslaughter. Guilty of a lesser charge, reckless driving. The sentence: 6 months in a low-security facility, suspended, and a $5,000 fine. Brady Thompson had served no jail time for the deaths of a woman and a child. 2 weeks after the verdict, Judge Samuel Carter, a man at the peak of his profession, had submitted a 1-sentence letter of resignation and disappeared from public life. Alex leaned back in his chair, the file open on his desk. The sterile, air-conditioned silence of his office felt heavy, suffocating. He looked out at the glittering city, but he didn't see a kingdom to be conquered. He saw a cold, indifferent machine. He finally understood. Carter hadn't just lost his family. He had been failed by the very system he had dedicated his life to upholding. The law, in all its majestic, impartial logic, had been twisted into a tool to protect the privileged and deny justice to the grieving. The slick lawyering, the procedural gamesmanship, the focus on performance over truth, it was the same kind of law Alex himself practiced. The lawyer who had gotten Brady Thompson off could have been him. The casual cruelty of his own words came back to him with the force of a physical blow. Some people spend their lives creating empires. Others spend their lives cleaning up the messes. He had said that to a man whose entire world had been an empire of love and family, an empire that had been turned into a mess of wreckage and grief by a man just like him. The arrogance, the ignorance, the sheer, profound blindness of it made him feel sick to his stomach. His ambition, his wins, his bespoke suits, his corner office, it all seemed like a hollow, pathetic joke. He had built his life on a foundation of sand, and a quiet old man with a mop had just shown him that the tide was coming in. He sat there for hours, the file open before him, as the city outside went to sleep and the sky began to lighten in the east. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about how to win. He was thinking about the cost of winning. He was thinking about the weight of a life, and the unbearable lightness of a justice system that could sometimes forget to value it. The ghost of Judge Carter, the man he had read about, and the reality of Samuel Carter, the man he had insulted, merged into one formidable, heartbreaking figure. And Alex Thompson, for the first time in his life, felt truly deeply ashamed. When Alex walked into the courtroom the next day, he was a different man. The change was not obvious on the surface. His suit was still impeccable, his hair perfectly coiffed, but the arrogant fire in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, somber intensity. His team noticed it immediately. The usual pre-court bravado was gone, replaced by short, direct instructions. The case was nearing its end. All that remained were the closing arguments. Sarah Jennings went first. She delivered a powerful, heartfelt summation, weaving the facts of the case into a clear narrative of corporate greed and betrayal. She spoke of the weight of the truth, and Alex knew, with a certainty that made his skin crawl, that she was using the janitor's own words. She concluded by looking at the jury and saying simply, "Ben Carter is not asking for a lottery ticket. He is asking for what was stolen from him to be returned. He is asking for justice." Then it was Alex's turn. He walked to the lectern, the silence in the room absolute. He looked at his notes, a brilliantly crafted closing argument designed to create doubt, to appeal to prejudice, to win at all costs. He saw the faces of the jury, waiting to be persuaded. He saw his client, the Omnicorp CEO, looking at him with an expectant, demanding expression. And he saw Judge Carter sitting silently, his face unreadable, his presence a constant reminder of the story Alex had read the night before. Alex took a deep breath. He pushed his notes aside. He began to speak, and the voice that came out was not his usual smooth, commanding baritone. It was quieter, more hesitant, stripped of its usual artifice. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began. "For the past week, you have listened to a great deal of testimony. You have heard from experts. You have examined documents. My job now is to stand before you and tie all of it together, to persuade you of my client's innocence." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. "And my client Omnicorp is indeed a great company. It is an engine of innovation and commerce. But that is not what this case is about." He turned slightly, looking not at the jury, but towards Ben Carter. "This case is about a man, Mr. Ben Carter, who had an idea. A brilliant idea. And he worked and he sacrificed and he poured his life into that idea. He built something. And the evidence, when viewed without the fog of legal maneuvering, the evidence is clear." A shocked gasp rippled through his side of the courtroom. The Omnicorp CEO shot up in his chair. Arthur Thompson's face went pale. Alex ignored them. He was no longer speaking to them. He was speaking to the judge, to the jury, and to some new unfamiliar conscience within himself. The evidence shows that Omnicorp had access to Mr. Carter's code. The evidence shows that Omnicorp's timeline for developing their own, strikingly similar product is improbable at best. The evidence shows that Dr. Evans, our own expert, was not a disinterested party. He took another breath, the words coming more easily now, as if a great weight was being lifted from his chest. "There is a difference between what is legal and what is right," he said, his voice gaining strength. "We, as lawyers, spend our lives skillfully navigating the space between those two things. We build arguments. We create narratives. We construct houses, sometimes on foundations of fact and sometimes on less. I have built a career on being very, very good at that." He finally looked directly at Judge Carter. "But this court," he said, his voice thick with a new, unidentifiable emotion, "has reminded me that our primary duty is not to our clients, nor to our own ambition. It is to the truth. And the truth has a weight to it." He turned back to the jury. "I cannot, in good conscience, stand here and tell you to ignore the weight of the truth in this case. I can only ask that you look at the evidence, that you consider the facts, and that you do what is just." He then said the 4 words that would end his career at his father's firm and signal the death of the man he used to be. "Thank you. No further argument." He walked back to his table and sat down, refusing to look at the apoplectic face of his client or the stunned, ashen face of his father. The courtroom was in a state of utter pandemonium-laced silence. No one knew what to do. A defense attorney had just, in essence, conceded his own case. Judge Carter, however, remained perfectly calm. He showed no surprise, no emotion at all. He simply turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice even and steady, "you have heard the evidence and the closing arguments. Your instructions on the law will be provided to you in writing. You may now retire to the jury room to begin your deliberations." As the jury filed out, a new kind of chaos erupted. The Omnicorp CEO was screaming at Alex, his face purple with rage. Arthur Thompson was trying to restrain him. Reporters in the back were already scrambling for their phones. Alex didn't hear any of it. He was looking at the judge's bench. Judge Carter was gathering his papers, his movements as slow and deliberate as ever. He stood, and for a fleeting moment, his eyes met Alex's across the tumultuous room. And in the old man's eyes, Alex saw it. Not pity, not praise, not even forgiveness. He saw a flicker of something that looked almost like hope. Then the Honorable Samuel Carter, the ghost judge, turned and walked into his chambers, leaving the wreckage of Alex Thompson's former life for someone else to clean up. Chapter 11. The Janitor's Closet. The verdict was a formality. The jury was out for less than an hour. They found in favor of Innovate on all counts, awarding Ben Carter damages that would not only save his company, but make him a wealthy man. The courtroom erupted, Ben and Sarah in a tearful embrace, the Omnicorp team in a state of furious disbelief. Alex was already gone. He had walked out of the courtroom the moment the jury had gone to deliberate, pushing past the throng of reporters, ignoring the venomous shouts of his former client and the stricken look on his father's face. He didn't go back to his office. He didn't go home. He went to the basement. He found the janitor's closet, a small unassuming door in a dim concrete corridor. The door was unlocked. He opened it and stepped inside. The small space was crowded but orderly. Shelves were neatly lined with cleaning supplies. Mops and brooms stood at attention in a corner. The air smelled strongly of bleach and damp earth. An overturned bucket sat in the center of the room, the same one Alex imagined the old man sat on during his breaks. He stood there in the quiet, the chaos of the world upstairs seeming a million miles away. He had lost everything. His case, his career, his father's respect. The entire edifice of his life had crumbled to dust in the space of a single morning. And yet he felt a strange, unfamiliar sense of peace. He felt clean. He heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and measured. The door opened and Samuel Carter stood there. He was no longer Judge Carter. The robe was gone. He was wearing his simple work clothes again, his overalls slung over one shoulder. He was just Sam, the janitor, returning to his sanctuary at the end of a long day. He didn't seem surprised to find Alex standing in his closet. He simply looked at him with those ancient, knowing eyes. "They'll be looking for you upstairs," Sam said, his voice quiet. "Let them look," Alex replied, his own voice hoarse. "I came to find you." Sam nodded slowly. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, plunging the small room into a shared intimacy. He gestured to the overturned bucket. "Have a seat. It's the best one in the house." Alex remained standing. "I read about you," he said. "About your family. About the trial." Sam's face, for a moment, seemed to tighten, the lines around his eyes deepening. But his expression remained calm. "The past is a heavy thing to carry," was all he said. "I'm sorry," Alex said, the words feeling small and inadequate. "For what I said. By the jury box. I was arrogant. Cruel. I didn't know." "You didn't know the specifics," Sam corrected him gently. "But you knew I was a man. That should have been enough." The simple truth of the statement hit Alex with renewed force. He had no defense. "Why?" Alex asked, a genuine, desperate curiosity in his voice. "Why come back here? Why this? After everything you were, everything that happened?" Sam took a moment before answering. He leaned against a shelf of cleaning rags, looking not at Alex, but at some distant point in his memory. "When I lost my family," he began, his voice soft as dust, "I lost my faith. Not in God. In the law. I saw it, the thing I had built my life on, twisted into a weapon against justice. The robe felt dirty. I couldn't wear it anymore." He looked at his own gnarled hands. "So I came back here. To the one place I knew. I thought if I couldn't serve justice from the bench, maybe I could serve it on my knees. By making the place where justice is supposed to happen clean. Orderly. Place of dignity. It was a kind of penance, I suppose." He finally looked up, meeting Alex's gaze. "But I also stayed to watch," he continued, "to see if the things I believed in still existed. I watched the good ones like Ms. Jennings fight against impossible odds. And I watched the ones like you, the brilliant broken ones who had mistaken the game for the goal. I'm not like the man who represented the driver," Alex said, the words sounding weak even to his own ears. "Aren't you?" Sam asked, his voice without judgment, a simple probing question. "You use the same tools. The same tactics. The only difference is that today you chose to stop." The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken meaning. "What you did up there today," Sam said finally, "that took a different kind of courage. More than it takes to win. It takes courage to look at the house you've built your entire life and admit that the foundation is rotten. It takes courage to tear it all down." "I have nothing left," Alex said, the reality of it washing over him again. "You have everything left," Sam countered, his voice firm. "You have a chance to build something new, something stronger, on a better foundation." He pushed himself off the shelf and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the knob. "Justice isn't about the robes you wear or the title on your door, son," he said, looking back at Alex one last time. "It's about what you do when no one is watching. It's about cleaning up the messes, especially the ones you make yourself. Remember that." He opened the door and stepped out, leaving Alex alone in the quiet, bleach-scented darkness. The law offices of the public defender were a world away from the 42nd floor splendor of Thompson, Sterling, and Finch. The offices were cramped, the lighting was fluorescent, the coffee was burnt, and the air hummed with a constant, desperate energy. It was a place of lost causes and last chances, and it was where Alex Thompson now worked. He sat at a small, cluttered metal desk, a stack of files threatening to overwhelm him. His suit was no longer Tom Ford. It was a simple, durable wool from a department store. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a weary but determined competence. The fire was still there, but it was no longer fueled by ego. It was fueled by something else. He was representing a young woman accused of shoplifting baby formula. He was preparing to argue that her actions were a product of poverty and desperation, not criminal intent. A year ago, he would have scoffed at such a defense. Now, he believed in it with every fiber of his being. He had been fired, of course. His father had disowned him, calling his actions in the Omnicorp case an unforgivable betrayal. The legal community had treated him as a pariah for a time. But then, a different kind of reputation began to form. He was the man who had torpedoed his own career for the sake of the truth. Sarah Jennings, now a partner at a small but respected civil rights firm thanks to the fame of the Omnicorp case, had been the one to recommend him to the public defender's office. "He's brilliant," she had told the director, "and I think he finally has a soul." He rarely thought about his old life. When he did, it felt like a dream of a different person. His real life was here in these trenches, fighting for people who had no one else to fight for them. He didn't win every case. In fact, he lost more than he won. But every day he fought. He built his houses on foundations of fact. One evening, leaving the courthouse late after a long day of hearings, he saw a familiar figure by the main entrance, slowly and methodically sweeping the steps. It was Sam. Alex paused. He hadn't seen him in months. The story of the janitor judge had become a courthouse legend, but Sam himself had slipped back into his quiet, invisible life. He had never taken the bench again. Alex approached him quietly. "Sam." The old man looked up, a slow, gentle smile touching his lips. He leaned on his broom. "Mr. Thompson. Still cleaning up messes, I see." There was a twinkle in his eye, a shared understanding that passed between them. "Trying to," Alex said with a tired smile of his own. "It's harder than it looks." "The important things usually are," Sam said. They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of the city swirling around them. "I heard you're going to be a judge again," Alex said. "The president is nominating you to the Supreme Court." Sam chuckled, a dry rustling sound. "Where did you hear that nonsense?" "I read it in a newspaper," Alex said. "I think the headline was 'Local Man Sweeps the Nation.'" Sam laughed, a real genuine laugh this time. The sound was warm and kind. "Don't believe everything you read, son. My work is here." He gestured with his broom to the sprawling courthouse, its stone facade glowing in the evening light. He wasn't pointing at the judge's chambers on the top floor. He was indicating all of it, the steps, the floors, the unseen corners, the very foundation. "Well," Alex said, shouldering his worn briefcase. "Thank you. For everything." "You did the work, Alex," Sam said, his smile fading into a look of quiet, paternal pride. "You did the work." Alex nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He turned and walked down the steps, disappearing into the river of humanity on the sidewalk. Samuel Carter watched him go. He watched until the young man, who had once been so lost, was swallowed up by the city. Then he turned back to his task. He held the broom in his work-worn hands, a simple tool for a simple job. He was a janitor, a custodian, a keeper of the echoes, and in the quiet halls of justice, he continued his work, a silent guardian ensuring the foundation was always clean and always strong. Do not forget to subscribe, comment, and share.